Welcome, and thank you for attending today's training related to multiple property documents in Oregon. Today's training is geared towards state, local, and federal agencies or other entities in Oregon doing work that requires regulatory or compliance review. We will be providing an overview of MPDs, how they can be used to streamline evaluations of historic register eligibility or as mitigation, and how to use an MPD to prepare an Associated National Register nomination. The Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, provides project review and compliance to determine if projects will have impacts on properties of historic significance. This consultation process includes working with federal, state, and local agencies, and even private landowners. With that in mind, here is our agenda for the training. We'll begin with introductions. After that, we'll outline the intended objectives for this training for agencies that consult with the SHPO Project Review and Compliance Team. We'll highlight what triggers project review and the consultation and introduce how MPDs can connect with this work. We'll then provide a discussion of what exactly MPDs are and how they work in the National Register of Historic Places. This will be followed by an overview of MPDs that currently exist in Oregon, and then identify a few MPDs that have been used in regulatory review as examples. That will then lead into a discussion on how to use an MPD to prepare an associated nomination. This training is hosted by the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, part of Oregon Heritage, which is housed within the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. The work of the Oregon SHPO can be divided into 5 categories: project review and compliance, document and find, designate, engage and advocate, and preserve. In accordance with state and federal laws, the Oregon SHPO provides project review and compliance to determine if a project will have impacts on properties of historic significance. This consultation process includes working with federal, state, and local agencies, and even private landowners to assess impacts on prehistoric or historic districts, sites, buildings, structures, objects, artifacts, records, material remains, and traditional, religious, spiritual, storied, or legendary places. Under Document and Find, the SHPO manages survey and inventory work in the state and maintains the state's historic sites database. With Designate, the SHPO reviews and assists with nominations to the National Register of Historic Places and manages Oregon Main Street, historic cemeteries, Oregon Heritage Traditions, and certified local government programs. With Engage and Advocate, the SHPO provides workshops like this training, as well as conferences, and commissions studies and reports and statewide plans. And under Preserve, the SHPO manages grant programs, administers tax incentive programs, and serves as a technical resource for preservation. This training is led by 2 consultants, Katie Pratt of Northwest Vernacular and Sarah Martin of SJM Cultural Resource Services. I am Katie, and I have worked as a historic preservation consultant in the Pacific Northwest since 2009 and am a graduate of the University of Oregon's Historic Preservation Program. My colleague Sarah is a former National Register Coordinator for the Kansas State Historic Preservation Office and has been a consultant in the Pacific Northwest since 2015.
As we've mentioned, this training is specifically for local, state, and federal agencies operating in Oregon. We hope you will walk away with a clear understanding of MPDs, what they look like, how they're used, and how they can be helpful beyond the scope of the National Register program. Second, you will have a greater awareness of the number and variety of MPDs in Oregon, as well as an understanding of what MPDs are available to use. Many of you are familiar with the typical process of nominating a property or historic district to the National Register of Historic Places through the completion of a National Register nomination form. We'll cover this in more depth shortly, but in that nomination form, the preparer must establish the property or district's significance within its historic context. This can encompass multiple historical and architectural themes, making for a long and time-intensive document. The MPD, however, offers a different way to nominate properties that ultimately reduces the amount of documentation needed for each nomination. How so? Well, the MPD form serves as a sort of cover document to collect information on related properties and to evaluate the National Register eligibility of those related properties. Then, individual National Register nominations with the necessary property specific research are completed using the context and evaluation framework in the MPD. MPDs can be used over and over again to nominate related properties, not just at the time the MPD is submitted. An MPD form takes a group of related properties, like historic lighthouses or historic bridges, across a particular geographic area and identifies common themes, trends, and patterns of histories for that group of properties. An MPD's geographic scope can be limited to a single neighborhood or community, or can cover a broad geographic range. Ultimately, an MPD provides the framework for either the simultaneous or future listings of related properties. Lastly, it's important to highlight the differences between historic districts and MPDs and that they're not interchangeable. Historic districts are typically defined by a contiguous boundary that encircles a concentration of resources that are linked historically or aesthetically, like, for example, a downtown or a neighborhood. Resources within historic districts are significant as part of the district's collection of resources and may not be individually eligible for the National Register. However, properties nominated as part of an MPD must be individually eligible for the National Register, as outlined by the MPD's registration requirements. The properties must be able to stand on their own. Further, properties nominated as part of an MPD are not required to be geographically linked. For example, a post office in Bend and a school in Salem can both be nominated under the Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA, provided they meet that MPD's registration requirements.
Now that we've briefly discussed what a multiple property document or MPD is, we thought we'd provide a brief overview or reminder of the National Register of Historic Places, what it is, and how properties qualify for designation or listing. In the case of local, state, and federal agencies, the National Register is important to understand because its criteria for evaluation and eligibility requirements are what are used when assessing whether properties impacted by projects have historic significance. The National Register is our nation's list of historically significant properties, specifically sites, structures, objects, buildings, and districts. In order to be eligible for listing, properties must meet certain age, significance, and integrity requirements. First, a property must be at least 50 years of age or have exceptional documented significance. Then, it must be historically significant, which we will discuss more in depth on the next slide, but ultimately, it means that the property must have clear history associated with it. And then finally, it must retain enough physical integrity to convey that historical significance. There are 7 aspects of integrity: location, design, materials, workmanship, setting, feeling, and association. A property does not need to retain 100% of all aspects, nor is there even an established rubric to determine how much of each aspect is necessary. Rather, an argument must be made that the property retains enough integrity to be able to communicate its history or story. For example, alterations may reflect work a user had to complete in order to use the property, and although not original, demonstrate that user's connection to the property. In assessing whether a property or resource has historic significance, the National Register provides 4 criteria for evaluation, A, B, C, and D. Some properties may be significant under more than one criterion. Properties are significant under criterion A if they are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. Criterion A recognizes properties associated with single events, such as the founding of a town, or with a pattern of events, repeated activities, or historic trends, such as the gradual rise of a port city's prominence in trade and commerce. Mere association with historic events or trends is not enough, in and of itself, to qualify under Criterion A. The property's specific association must be considered important as well. For example, a building historically in commercial use must be shown to have been significant in commercial history. An example of a historic district listed under Criterion A is the Oregon State University Historic District in Corvallis. The district is listed under Criterion A for its important association with education and community planning, and in this case, the district is significant at the statewide level. Properties are significant under Criterion B if they are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. Criterion B applies to properties associated with individuals whose specific contributions to history can be identified and documented. Persons significant in our past refers to individuals whose activities are demonstrably important within a local, state, or national historic context. The criterion is generally restricted to those properties that illustrate rather than commemorate. An example of a property listed under Criterion B is the Zane Grey cabin on the Rogue River in Josephine County. Grey was the author of popular Western novels. Although the cabin was not Grey's primary residence, it was built by Grey and used as a retreat for nearly a decade. During his ownership of the cabin, Grey authored more than 20 books as well as numerous articles, many of which were either written at the cabin or inspired by its location. Properties are significant under Criterion C if they embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or that possess high artistic values, or that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. For properties that embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, this relates to the way in which a property was conceived, designed, or fabricated by a people or culture in past periods of history. Work of a master means the technical or aesthetic achievements of an architect or craftsman. High artistic values means the expression of aesthetic ideals or preferences and applies to aesthetic achievement. And resources that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction are called districts. For example, the Coos Bay Bridge number 01823, which is listed under the Condie-McCullough Bridge Design MPD, is significant under Criterion C because it embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, and method of construction for mid-20th century reinforced concrete arch bridge technology. It is also significant under Criterion C as the work of a master, Condie B. McCullough, who was Oregon State Bridge Engineer from 1919 to 1936. Properties are significant under Criterion D if they have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. While most often applied to archaeological districts and sites, Criterion D can also apply to buildings, structures, and objects that contain important information. This criterion is the least represented of the 4 in Oregon, with just over 50 listings, and the majority of these are archaeological sites whose locations are restricted to protect them. So with all that in mind, what content is contained in an MPD? An MPD form contains similar information as a National Register nomination. We will go over each section later on in this presentation, but the MPD form basically has 3 additional components than a typical National Register nomination form: associated historic contexts, associated property types, and registration requirements. Associated historic context is similar to the Statement of Significance section in a National Register nomination, but specifically outlines a historical theme, geographical area covered by the MPD, and a chronological period. The historic context, as there may be more than one included within an MPD, establish the framework within which to understand associated properties. While it may reference specific people or properties, the context must be general enough to apply to all the associated properties. Associated property types provide categories of properties that are eligible within the associated historic context. There may be one or more associated property types within the MPD. For example, the Craftsman Bungalows in Deschutes County MPD only relates to residential single-family properties, but it does outline the varying Craftsman Bungalow forms. The associated property types section describes the physical characteristics and associative qualities of each type. Registration requirements define the standards and requirements for nominating a property that falls into one of the associated property types. If a property meets an MPD's registration requirements, then it is eligible for listing in the National Register under that MPD. In this way, MPDs help map the path toward designation for their associated property types. MPDs with clear registration requirements provide guidance for evaluating associated property types within the context of the National Register's criteria for evaluation. Now that we have a baseline on MPDs and the National Register of Historic Places, let's talk about MPDs specifically in Oregon. There are 54 MPDs in Oregon, including multi-state MPDs that include Oregon, which is higher than the national average of 45 per state and the median of 40. These MPDs vary in geographic scope and types of resources. The Oregon SHPO maintains a list of them, but they are also available through their Historic Sites database, along with other surveys, under group name. When a search is conducted for an MPD, the database will pull up the MPD form and any individual nominations associated with that MPD. Properties may be listed under one or more MPDs. MPDs have been developed for a number of reasons in Oregon and elsewhere in the country, and the use of MPDs, both in the creation of the initial MPD form and the subsequent associated listings, reflect this range of reasons. The earliest completed MPD in Oregon is the Oregon Covered Bridges from 1979, which lists 40 properties. A bridge has been listed under this MPD as recently as 2013. The Native American Archaeological Sites of the Oregon Coast MPS from 1997 has the most properties listed under it with 96. While this archaeological multiple property submission has not been used since its initial listing, it represents a decade of archaeological investigation and is the MPD in the state with the greatest number of associated National Register listings. It also represents one successful way to use the MPD form. Establish the historic context, associated property types, and registration requirements to list all identified properties in one fell swoop. Ultimately, MPDs in Oregon cover a range of property types, from archaeological sites, cemeteries and landscapes, to residential and commercial neighborhoods, lighthouse stations, Forest Service buildings, barns, bridges, social halls, and other areas of social and civic gathering, and even irrigation and mining projects. This video shows in real time how to navigate the Oregon SHPO website to find the Oregon Historic Sites database. To start, go to the Oregon Heritage homepage, the landing page for the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office. The website is oregon.gov/oprd/oh/ or else you can utilize a search engine and look for Oregon SHPO, and this website should be the first hit. Once on the Oregon SHPO website homepage, which you can see here, locate the Document and Find section. Beneath it, you'll see Find an Historic Place. If you click on that, it will automatically launch the Oregon Historic Sites database. Once in the database, search under Group Name. Depending on your web browser and screen size, this screen may look slightly different to you. You can scroll down to select an MPD or previous survey. We selected Barns of Lynn County, Oregon, 1846 to 1946, and then clicked Search. You can see that the original Barnes of Lynn County, Oregon MPD shows up, as well as properties that have been listed using that MPD. If you click on the Form button for an individual property, it will take you to the site information for the property. Under Groupings and Associations, you can see that it was listed in association with the Barnes of Lynn County, Oregon MPD. You can also click on the National Register or NR nomination link on the left-hand side of the screen to download the individual form. In addition to covering a range of property types, MPDs have fairly broad geographic distribution in Oregon. On this map, you can see communities highlighted and their number of individual listings associated with them. Unsurprisingly, Portland, as the state's largest city, has the most National Register listings associated with MPDs, with 115 listings, or 24% of all MPD-associated listings in the state. Understandably, the populated Willamette Valley also has a number of National Register listings associated with MPDs, but we do see listings in more rural communities like Enterprise, Wallowa, and Nisa, and along the coastline.
Oregon's MPDs cover a broad range of themes and time periods. The themes correspond to the National Register program's areas of significance. This slide illustrates not only the broad range of themes, but shows the frequency in which they're used, such as architecture, which is covered in 35 MPDs, community planning and development, covered in 21, and commerce in 15. The MPDs address these themes in varying degrees, some more thoroughly than others, providing both focused and broad historical context. For example, those MPDs focused on residential resources tend to highlight themes of architecture and community planning and development, while MPDs focused on commercial resources tend to highlight themes on commerce, architecture, and industry.
There are a number of MPDs that cross state boundaries, including historic residential suburbs in the United States from 1830 to 1960, United States Forest Service recreation facilities, public housing in the United States, and National Park Service Mission 66 era resources. The historic context of the Historic Residential Suburbs MPD covers the evolution of American suburbs from 1830 to 1960. It is a rich source of information about how suburbs have developed in our country and can be used for evaluating historic districts that are primarily residential in character. So residential neighborhoods that are outside of the city center but connected through one or more modes of transportation. The U.S. Forest Service Recreation Facilities MPD broadly addresses USFS recreation facilities on Forest Service land throughout the country. The Forest Service manages over 10,000 recreation facilities dating from 1905 to 1980. This MPD primarily focuses on structures and landscape features that were constructed within two major eras of investment in Forest Service recreation infrastructure: the Depression era from 1933 to 1942, and the Operation Outdoors era from 1957 to 1969. The historic context of the public housing in the United States MPD extends from 1933 until 1949 and addresses the political, social, and architectural trends that shaped the federal public housing program. This MPD provides the framework for analyzing and understanding the historic role and significance of individual public housing projects. While this MPD only applies to public housing projects, it is an important document for laying out the history of the program. The National Park Service Mission 66 era Resources MPD provides the context for individual listing of buildings constructed within the National Park Service from 1945 through 1972. The Mission 66 program was the largest construction program in the history of the agency and was a noted shift towards the modern movement in a time when visitors flooded national parks after a period of rationing and travel restrictions during World War II. Similarly, there are several statewide MPDs which can be used throughout Oregon. For example, the MPD Black Historic Resources in Oregon 1788 to 2022 can be used statewide in areas where there is at least one historic resource related to Black history in Oregon over an incredibly long period, which means it covers a wide range of property types, including buildings, structures, sites, objects, and districts. Another example is the Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA, which focuses on public work relief projects of the Great Depression. Many Oregon communities have buildings associated with these New Deal programs, including post offices, courthouses, city halls, schools, libraries, etc. As of May 2025, there are 13 statewide MPDs in Oregon, which are listed on the screen.
In addition to the statewide MPDs, there are also several regional ones. That is, MPDs that are not contained just to a specific neighborhood or city, but have a larger geographic scope, just not the entire state. There are 8 regional MPDs in Oregon, which are listed on the screen. We're now going to highlight a few MPDs that demonstrate the range available in Oregon and that are ready to be used, whether that's to do more National Register listings or to reference their rich historic contexts for compliance or interpretive work. The first MPD we'll highlight is about the Oregon Trail, a 19th century emigrant wagon road stretching more than 2,000 miles from Missouri to Oregon's Willamette Valley. Although the old road traversed several states, the geographic scope of this MPD is limited to the trail corridor within Oregon. The MPD includes 4 historic contexts that discuss the geography, character, and setting of the road, its uses for exploration, transportation, and settlement, its social, political, and cultural significance, and finally, its economic and commercial significance. The MPD identifies 14 associated property types, ranging from road sections to river crossing points, and from trading posts to camping sites. This MPD is a great resource for both archaeologists and historians for its early settlement context as it relates to the trail. Beyond the scope of the Oregon Trail, the MPD is useful as a reference for understanding linear resources, how viewsheds and viewpoints relate to significance and eligibility, and for its information on early town development. The next MPD focuses on agricultural irrigation systems developed by the U.S. government in Oregon's arid and semi-arid lands. The Carry and Reclamation Act's MPD provides a framework for identifying and evaluating surviving irrigation systems that were developed between 1901 and 1978. It includes 2 historic contexts that are relevant to federal irrigation projects in central and eastern Oregon. It identifies 3 associated property types and several subtypes. Much like the Oregon Trail MPD, this one is useful to both archaeologists and historians who are investigating properties along and adjacent to the irrigation systems. It's also potentially useful to those investigating irrigation resources beyond the defined historic and geographic scopes of the MPD. And lastly, the MPD is an excellent reference document for anyone documenting communities impacted by irrigation.
The context statement in the Oregon National Guard Armories MPD describes the history of Oregon Army National Guard armories constructed from 1888 to 1978 and details the historic events that influenced their design, siting, and construction. This MPD was completed quite recently in 2022, and it has a very useful integrity matrix for evaluating eligibility of individual armories. While this MPD is limited to the 54 identified National Guard armories in the state, the document's detail and organization provides an excellent template for other MPDs. The Bonneville Power Administration, a federal agency created by Congress in 1937, operates more than 15,000 circuit miles of electrical transmission lines spread over all or portions of 8 states. The BPA transmission system includes thousands of individual built elements within the Columbia River Basin and provides electricity throughout the Pacific Northwest. Although the built resources of the BPA are primarily located in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and western Montana, the system extends into parts of Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, and California. As a result, this MPD has a broad geographic scope with associated properties located in all 8 of these states. The historic context extends from 1938 to 1974, and this MPD has been an incredibly useful tool for evaluating all BPA properties within Oregon.
We'd like to now shift and discuss how to create and use an MPD. The National Register of Historic Places program published guidance on MPDs in its Bulletin 16B, How to Complete the National Register Multiple Property Documentation Form. The bulletin was last updated in 1999, but the information is still relevant and useful. You can find it on the web simply by searching NR Bulletin 16B. In terms of creating or amending an MPD, it's best to familiarize yourself with Bulletin 16B and reach out to the SHPO staff to discuss the feasibility and possible scope of producing a new or amended document. It's important to note that producing an MPD is a longer and more intensive effort than drafting an individual nomination. The cornerstone of any MPD is survey data coupled with historical research, which together inform the MPD's geographic scope, time frame, property types, and registration requirement. So if there's no relevant survey data, or if it's outdated, the SHPO staff will likely suggest that you build into your plan the collection and analysis of survey data. We also suggest you identify a handful of properties to potentially nominate along with the new or amended MPD. When it comes to using an MPD to nominate a property or historic district, it's important to familiarize yourself with the subject property or properties to confirm they're a good fit with the MPD. Confirming this with SHPO staff is also a good idea before proceeding with completing a nomination form. Now, let's dig into the MPD form to better understand how it's organized. Unlike the National Register nomination form, which is organized into numbered sections 1 through 11, the multiple property documentation form is divided into lettered sections A through I. The first 4 sections, A, B, C, and D, are found on the cover page of the document, page 1 of the MPD. Section A is the name of the MPD. Section B lists the associated historic context used to produce the MPD. Section C lists the MPD authors and the date it was prepared. And finally, Section D provides the certification information that is completed by the SHPO and National Register staffs. The next 5 sections make up the bulk of the MPD form. Section E includes the long footnoted narratives that present the history, patterns, and trends that relate to and tie together the group of properties. Section F is where the group of properties are divided into property types that are defined by common characteristics. Section G provides the geographic boundaries of the area covered by the MPD. Section H is where the nomination preparer describes their research methods. And Section I is the bibliography of major sources used to produce the various parts of the MPD. So that's all the pieces of the MPD form. If you're submitting a new form, it must be accompanied by at least one individual nomination, together called a multiple property submission or a multiple property nomination. This associated nomination serves as a kind of proof of concept for the MPD.
Historic contexts provide information about the historical patterns and trends that produced individual properties. Historic contexts help us understand how a property fits into the broader story, and they serve as the foundation for decisions made about the identification, planning, and treatment of historic properties. There are many ways in which to look at historic properties, which means there are a number of ways of documenting historic contexts. The purpose or need for evaluating and managing historic properties can help determine the approach. While these can be tackled in several ways, there are three main approaches: thematic, geographic, and chronological. While a nominator may approach development of historic contexts in a thematic, geographic, and or chronological way, all contexts must address these aspects in some way. MPDs have to have a geographic and temporal boundary, and associated property types must be related or linked by at least one thematic commonality. By type, so for example, bridges or bungalows, or by historic association, so for example, buildings by a particular architect or resources associated with Black history. For the thematic approach, a nominator could emphasize economic or political forces or even the role of specific groups in shaping a region's history. Architecture is often a theme that can be used to organize the historic context. However, care should be taken not to overly narrow the focus. For example, writing a historic context about duplexes will be overly specific, while one about apartment or multiple family type dwellings in general will be far more useful. A geographic approach looks at a specific geographic area. This can be a neighborhood, city, region, or even a state. And we see this approach in a number of MPDs that just apply to specific areas, like U.S. forest land or national parks.
Property types are outlined in Section F. A property type ties the historic context presented in Section E to specific properties so that National Register eligibility may be assessed. A property type is a grouping of resources defined by common physical attributes, such as architectural style, building or structural form, design, method of construction, materials, as well as associative attributes, such as the property's relationship to important historical events, trends, people, and cultural affiliations. For example, earlier we featured the Oregon National Guard Armory's MPD. It includes property types defined by physical attributes, namely architectural styles. For an example of an MPD that has property types defined by associative qualities, see the MPD Oregon New Deal Resources from the PWA and WPA, which organizes property types by their function and association with public work relief projects during the Great Depression. And finally, property type analysis is a tool for evaluating related properties. Using survey data to study the various examples of the property type yields important information that informs register eligibility. What results from this analysis is the registration requirements, which help determine what properties are eligible. Registration requirements are central to the MPD and also are found in Section F. They specify the attributes that a resource must possess, or the thresholds that it must meet, to be eligible for the National Register for its association with one or more of the MPD's historic contexts. Most MPDs include general registration requirements that apply to all the property types covered by the document, with additional specific requirements for each property type. The requirements typically discuss key physical characteristics, significant associative qualities, and integrity as they relate to the property type to help nomination preparers assess a resource's eligibility. Ultimately, the requirements help nomination preparers compare like resources and make informed judgments about a property's relative significance and eligibility. There are a few important takeaways regarding registration requirements and property types. First, because of this comparative analysis, registration requirements can help someone determine when a property is not eligible. Second, just because a resource fits within a defined property type doesn't mean it's automatically eligible. It must also meet the registration requirements and have documented significance related to the MPD themes. And finally, think of the first associated nomination that's submitted with the MPD as a kind of proof of concept that will demonstrate the feasibility of the MPD. Those of you working in the review and compliance space will find MPDs useful for a variety of reasons. First, MPDs may be useful in nominating resources to the National Register if, for example, mitigation requires properties to be nominated. If you think a property may fit with an existing MPD, begin by confirming that the resource is within the geographic scope, noted in Section G, and matches with a property type that is noted in Section F. If so, reach out to the SHPO staff to discuss the registration requirements for the property type and to confirm eligibility before preparing a nomination. A nomination preparer should use the MPD in a couple of ways: as a source of information to be referenced in the text, like any other source, and also as a guide for justifying a property's eligibility under the registration requirements. Second, MPDs can be useful tools in helping determine whether or not a resource is eligible for the National Register. For example, if your compliance reviews involve residential properties, there are several residential focused MPDs that offer excellent guidance on assessing integrity and determining eligibility. Even if the resource isn't within the MPD's geographic scope, thematically relevant MPDs can still provide useful context. See, for example, the Craftsman Bungalows of Deschutes County MPD, or the Historic Residential Resources of Redmond MPD. Although the former is specific to Craftsman Bungalows in Deschutes County, its bungalow-specific context could be referenced in connection with a bungalow anywhere in the state, or its countywide history could be used as a foundation for other Deschutes County properties. And lastly, MPDs are rich with history and can be used as a reference material for reports or nominations that aren't directly linked to the MPD, or for other historic resource needs, like interpretive projects. A nomination preparer may benefit from asking SHPO staff for a good example of a property nomination that is linked to an MPD. The sample nomination will illustrate how and where to reference MPD-related material. For example, the introductory paragraphs of Section 8 in the nomination form should state the name of the MPD, identify the associated property type, and explain how the nominated resource meets both the general and property type specific registration requirements. The preparer may find it useful to quote and cite relevant material from the historic contexts in Section E to supplement the property-specific history. Broad background context that's already presented in the MPD doesn't need to be fully reproduced in an individual property nomination. In most cases, a reference to the MPD's context, coupled with a streamlined summary of the most relevant portions, are sufficient. This allows the nomination's context to be shorter and more focused than it might have been if written without the benefit of an MPD. For example, a nomination for a lodge that's eligible under the MPD Oregon New Deal resources from the PWA and WPA should include a reference to the comprehensive background history of New Deal programs in Oregon, but it doesn't need to present a full historic context like it would if there was no associated MPD. Because the MPD has already done a lot of the work of establishing a significant historic context for Oregon's New Deal resources, the individual nomination would primarily focus on the history and development of the lodge itself.
Thank you for participating in this training. Hopefully, this has made you think about new National Register listings you can pursue in your community and how MPDs in Oregon can assist you in that process. This training is one deliverable from a project worked on by consultants Northwest Vernacular and Sarah J. Martin Cultural Resource Services to evaluate and encourage the use of multiple property documentation forms, or MPDs, in the state of Oregon.